outside is held in the soft, velvet embrace of the deepest night. And as you settle into your blankets, imagine a vast stone hall where the air is cool and the stars are beginning to fade into a soft, hazy gray. Inside the library, the air is thick with the comforting, heavy scent of aged parchment, dried ink, and the faint, sweet dust of centuries, all lingering in the quiet space like a soft, invisible blanket. A single, small candle casts a dim, rhythmic orange glow against the high, arched shelves and the smooth, wooden tables, creating a space that is perfectly safe, perfectly warm, and perfectly still. You are invited now to let your own breath slow down, to match the steady, peaceful beat of the resting world, and to drift away into the gentle, repetitive motions of the librarian's quiet day, feeling perfectly safe and perfectly still. Chapter 1. The librarian stirs as the first hint of gray light begins to touch the high stone window of his cell, his eyes opening slowly to the familiar patterns of the shadows on the ceiling, and he feels a deep, heavy sense of peace as he rises from his narrow bed, his feet finding the cool, solid floorboards with a quiet and practiced ease that comes from 1,000 mornings just like this one. He moves with a slow and fluid grace, dressing in his thick wool habit, the fabric feeling soft and warm against his skin, and he reaches for the heavy iron ring of keys that hangs by the door, the metal clicking softly and musically in the silence of the early morning. He walks down the long, cool corridor of the monastery, his footsteps making a soft, rhythmic thud against the stone, a sound that is muted and deep, like the distant beating of a drum wrapped in velvet, and he finds a comfort in the repetition of his steps as he moves toward the great oak doors of the library. The air here is very still, smelling of the damp morning mist and the faint, clean scent of the courtyard garden, and he breathes it in deeply, feeling the coolness travel down into his chest and settle there like a quiet lake. He reaches the doors and selects the largest key, feeling the cold, heavy iron in his palm, and he slides it into the lock with a slow and deliberate motion, hearing the tumblers move with a solid, satisfying clack that echoes gently through the empty hallway. The doors swing open on well-oiled hinges, revealing the cavernous room where the books live, and the librarian stands for a moment on the threshold, simply breathing in the atmosphere of the space, which is thick with the smell of leather bindings dry, sweet scent of old paper. He begins his first task of the morning, which is the slow and meditative lighting of the candles, moving from one brass sconce to the next with a small taper, watching the tiny flames bloom like golden flowers in the dimness. He moves with a steady, unhurried pace, his arm rising and falling in a rhythmic arc. And with each candle, the room becomes a little warmer, a little more golden, and the shadows retreat into the high, vaulted corners of the ceiling. He follows the long rows of shelves, his fingers occasionally brushing against the spines of the books, feeling the different textures of the vellum and the rough-hewn wood. And he knows each one by its weight and its place in the silence. He reaches the main scriptorium, where the high desks stand in a neat row, and he begins to lay out the materials for the day, placing a clean sheet of parchment on the central table and smoothing it out with the palm of his hand, feeling the slight grain of the surface. He gathers his pots of ink, the dark, rich liquids sitting in heavy glass jars that catch the candlelight, and he sets his quills in a wooden tray, each one trimmed to a perfect, sharp point. The library is now fully awake in its own quiet way, the golden light reflecting off the stone walls and the polished wood of the tables. And the librarian feels a deep sense of belonging as he prepares to spend his day in the company of the words. There is no hurry, no urgency to the dawning day, only the slow transition from the stillness of sleep to the stillness of work, a transition marked by the smell of wax and the soft, white light that is now filling the room. He stands quite still for a long minute, watching a single dust mote drift through a beam of light, its movement so slow and aimless that it seems to be floating in a dream. And he feels his own thoughts becoming just as light and just as calm. The world outside may be waking to its chores and its noise, but here, the time is measured only by the steady burning of the candles and the slow, invisible passage of the sun across the stone floor. He is the guardian of the quiet, the keeper of the silence, and as he settles into his chair, he feels the peace of the library wrap around him like a heavy, protective cloak, keeping him safe and warm in the heart of the morning. Chapter 2. The morning passes in a long and hypnotic cycle of movement and stillness, a repetitive rhythm of writing and organizing that fills the librarian's heart with a steady, humming peace. As the light outside turns from a pale silver to a deep, buttery gold, he sits at his high desk, his back straight and his shoulders relaxed, and he takes up a quill with a slow and practiced grip, feeling the lightness of the feather in his fingers. He dips the nib into the dark ink, watching the liquid cling to the silver tip, and then he brings it to the parchment, the first stroke making a soft, scratching sound that is the only noise in the vast, quiet room. Scritch, scritch, scritch. A sound that is as rhythmic and calming as a heartbeat. He moves his hand in slow, careful loops, forming each letter with a deliberate precision, watching the black ink settle into the grain of the parchment and slowly dry into a permanent mark. His eyes move back and forth between the original manuscript and his own copy, a steady and hypnotic dance of focus that clears his mind of all but the immediate sensation of the quill and the page. Sometimes he pauses for a long minute just to look at a single word, admiring the way the ink has curled or the way the parchment holds the light. And he feels a deep satisfaction in the slow and beautiful craft of the word. After a time, he rises from his desk to organize the new arrivals, carrying a stack of heavy codices in his arms, the weight of the books a solid and comforting pressure against his chest. He moves to the back of the library, where the tall, arched shelves reach toward the ceiling, and he begins to slide the books into their places, one by one, hearing the soft, muffled sound of leather against wood. Thump, slide, thump, slide. A pattern that has no beginning and no end. He touches the spines as he goes, feeling the embossed titles and the cold metal of the clasps, and he enjoys the order and the logic of the rows, the way each book fits perfectly into its designated home. The light in the library is changing now, the shadows stretching out across the floorboards in long, thin fingers of gray, and the dust motes continue their lazy dance in the beams of light that stream through the high windows. He moves back to his desk and takes up a large volume of history, the cover feeling bumpy and ancient under his fingertips. And he begins the slow and meditative process of turning the pages, one by one, each sheet of parchment making a soft, dry rustle, like the sound of dry leaves in an autumn forest. Crinkle, flip, crinkle, flip, a sound that seems to slow down time itself. He reads with a quiet focus, his breath becoming a slow and steady wave that matches the pace of the narrative, and he feels himself drifting away into the stories of the past, becoming a part of the long, unbroken chain of memory that the library protects. The warmth of the room is a deep, all-encompassing heat that makes his limbs feel heavy and loose. And the only sound in the world is the soft, wet scratching of the quill and the distant, muffled sigh of the wind in the rafters. He pauses occasionally to trim a wick or add a drop of oil to a lamp, his movements fluid and slow, a part of the long and gentle dance of the day. He finds a simple joy in the texture of the ink on his skin, a small smudge of black on his thumb that reminds him of the work he has done, and he feels a deep and abiding connection to the materials of his craft. The library is a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world cannot reach, and he is content to exist in this circle of golden light and ancient words for as long as the sun remains in the sky. He watches a spider spinning a web in the corner of a shelf, its movements as slow and deliberate as his own, and he feels a kinship with every quiet creature that moves through the world with purpose and peace. The day is moving at the pace of the parchment, a slow and ancient tempo that allows for no stress and no worry. Only the steady and repetitive dance of the hands and the eyes and the mind. And as he turns another page, he feels a profound sense of gratitude for the quiet life he leads, for the books that tell their stories and the silence that listens. Chapter 3. The afternoon sun has begun its long and lazy slide toward the horizon. The light in the library turning from gold to a deep, warm amber. And the librarian feels a gentle, sleepy fatigue beginning to settle into his bones. A warm and pleasant tiredness that tells him the work of the day is done. He begins the final, quiet tasks of the evening with a body that feels heavy and pleasantly relaxed, moving through the scriptorium to gather his tools and return them to their proper places. He cleans his quill with a soft scrap of linen, wiping away the last traces of dark ink until the nib is bright and silver once more. And he places it carefully in its wooden tray, hearing the small, final click of wood against wood in the quiet room. He closes the ink jars with a slow and deliberate twist of his wrist, ensuring that the lids are tight and the liquid is safe. And he stacks the finished sheets of parchment in a neat, orderly pile that feels solid and significant under his hand. He rises from his chair with a slow stretch, his joints feeling loose and warm in the fading light, and he begins to walk the long aisles of the library for the last time that day, checking each shelf and each window to ensure that everything is in its place. He moves from sconce to sconce, extinguishing the candles with a small metal snuffer, watching the tiny curls of smoke rise into the air and disappear into the darkness. And with each flame that goes out, the room becomes a little cooler, a little more blue, and the silence becomes a little deeper. The smell of the extinguished wicks is a smoky, nostalgic scent that signals the end of the journey, and the librarian breathes it in with a sense of completion and peace. He reaches the great oak doors and steps out into the hallway, pulling the doors closed with a slow and heavy pull. And he turns the key in the lock, hearing the final, solid thunk that means the books are safe for the night. He walks back toward his small cell, his footsteps making a soft, rhythmic sound on the stone floor. And the world outside the windows is now a deep, velvet purple, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the vast, quiet sky. He enters his room and feels the softness of the evening air on his face, a cool and refreshing breeze that carries the scent of the sleeping garden and the damp earth. He undresses with slow and practiced movements, laying his habit across a wooden stool and feeling the lightness of his body as he prepares for rest. He climbs into his narrow bed, the linen sheets feeling cool and crisp against his skin, and he pulls the thick wool blankets up to his chin, tucking them in around his shoulders until he is encased in a cocoon of warmth and safety. He lies there for a moment with his eyes open, looking at the dim outlines of his room, the familiar shapes of the chest and the chair, and the small window where the moonlight filters through in a pale silver beam. His muscles feel loose and heavy, every tension of the day melting away into the soft mattress. And he lets his head sink into the pillow, his thoughts slowing down until they are nothing more than the gentle pulse of his own heartbeat. The silence of the monastery is total, a deep and liquid quiet that fills his ears and his heart. And he knows that the parchment is resting on the desk, the books are resting on the shelves, and the world is exactly as it should be. He closes his eyes and breathes in the faint scent of beeswax that lingers in his hair. And as the building settles around him with a final, gentle sigh, he drifts off into a sleep that is as deep and nourishing as the words he has spent his day copying. He feels the monastery around him, a sturdy shell of stone and timber, protecting him from the wind and the night. And he sinks further into the softness of the bed, his breath becoming a slow, rhythmic wave that carries him away. The world is far away now, a distant and hazy place that has no power over the stillness of his room. And he is a part of the night, a part of the parchment, and a part of the peace that remains when the ink is dry. Sleep comes to him like a slow tide, washing over him and pulling him down into the beautiful, heavy darkness, where he will rest until the stars fade once again and the quiet cycle begins anew. Sleep